Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. I would like to take you back in time, if I may, to autumn 2015, when the, as of that time, latest Bond film, Spectre, was about to be released.
All the promotional materials looking so great, though I was trying to suppress as much hype as possible by not dissecting every single trailer that came out, but I was pumped as hell on the 26th of October when I left work and headed to the cinema where I was going to see the 24th official James Bond adventure. I fawned over and humped at the leg of Skyfall a lot on this channel, and I still think that that movie holds up as one of the best Bonds ever, so as much as I was trying to temper my expectations, they were still super high. And as with every newly released Bond film, it takes a lot of time for it to really sink in and to be put into perspective with the rest of the series, so that's one of the reasons why I'm coming to this review so late after the film's release.
If you saw my immediate reaction videos after the film was released, you know that it had a kind of a lukewarm reception with me, but I'm looking at this almost 2 years later, and you know what, a lot of Bond films get better and better with multiple viewings over time, like Casino Royale, for example, for me. Others rot and get worse over time, like Quantum of Solace. So I feel like you need that appropriate level of distance from your initial viewing to fully evaluate the film. So without further ado, let's jump right in to Spectre.
Now, as you're probably aware, this is the first Craig film to begin with a traditional gun barrel sequence at the very start.
I could probably make a 30-minute video just about this gun barrel sequence, but for the sake of brevity, I hate it.
I was super ready for a classic gun barrel opening at the start of Skyfall, and I still think there should have been one there, but God, you think 4 films in, the Craig era would have managed to do at least one of these right. The Casino Royale sequence notwithstanding, that gun barrel rocks. All the other Craig films have had very poor gun barrel scenes. In this one's case, I hate how flat the gun barrel itself is. The Brosnan era had some awesome subtle 3D effects to it. Why not just update that? Craig's walk is good, but he's so clearly swinging that gun around. It's unbecoming of a secret agent. The blood dribbles down way too quickly. The dot doesn't even open us onto the scene, and then...
For a Bond film to open like this is not only an incredibly pretentious move, but it doesn't even make sense. I mean, yeah, you know, Silver and Le Chiffre and Vesper are all mentioned, and Judi Dench's M pops up in a video that the character recorded prior to her death in Skyfall, but, I mean, even on a thematic level, I'm not sure it makes much sense. It's like the dead are alive no more here than they were in Quantum of Solace.
But that hate quickly disappears when we get to the film's opening scene, which is a long, continuous, with the help of some clever editing, shot following a masked Bond and a girl through a Day of the Dead parade and hotel in Mexico. It's a great shot, wonderful entrance into the movie, and I especially love the moment when Bond gets out of his costume and effortlessly hops onto the balcony with a rifle to go and do his job. Craig is so cool in this moment. We've had 3 movies now about him becoming the Bond we all know, and here he is. This is Craig at Connery in Goldfinger level of cool. He's awesome, and while I'll take a big issue with the performance choice he makes later in the movie, I can't complain for the most part. The man is Bond in this movie. Anyway, onto a bit of plot. Bond is on a mission to assassinate a man called Marco Sciarra, who's planning a bomb attack on a stadium. Bond clocks a ring on Sciarra's finger that he uses to introduce himself with, and hears mention of someone called the Pale King. Bond's weapon sight gives him away, and in the crossfire, the bomb intended for the stadium is hit, and the building starts to collapse. Sure hope no civilians were at home. Bond escapes, though, with nothing more than a bit of a dusty suit, and pursues Sciarra along the Day of the Dead parade, where no one has apparently heard a bomb go off around the corner and the celebration is still in full force. The chase escalates onto a helicopter, which I must say I find very underwhelming. I've heard people praise this pre-title sequence, and while it looks good, it's shot very well and all that, I struggle, like, really struggle to fathom why people like it so much. When compared to most of the previous films in the series, it just feels so uninventive and basic. We've had Bond fight on helicopters before, and he just seems to make terrible choices when he hops into this one with Sciarra. Firstly, he decides to bash in the head of the pilot after the thing has taken off, which seems unwise considering Bond is on the helicopter and there are plenty of people down below. Then he engages in a fight, which, while well filmed and edited, doesn't feel quite as impressive as, say, the scene from For Your Eyes Only. Also, I can't be the only one missing a slide whistle from this particular shot, can I?
But truly, the thing that bothers me the most is when the music kicks in, because it just sounds like almost like the exact same tracks from Skyfall.
Now, I know that composers often reuse themes, and Lord knows we've heard some repeats of tracks in Bond films before, but not usually in, like, main action set pieces, well, not for decades anyway. I don't know if they ran out of time to compose new music or whatever, but the fact that there's so many repeated cues from Skyfall in this film really jumped out at me, because I love the Skyfall soundtrack. I think it's great and I listen to it often, so it really takes me out of the scene when I'm thinking, wait, isn't Bond supposed to be rigging his family home to blow up right now? Anyway, Bond of course defeats the baddies and pinches Sciarra's ring before flying off into the sunset and into the title sequence.
I've been here before, but always hit the floor.
Now, I know that Writings on the Wall by Sam Smith gets a bit of a bad rap from the fandom at large. Personally, I love the song. I think the orchestration is stunning. I think the lyrics are great. I can't defend Sam Smith's attempts at falsetto, but largely I think his singing is great, and he performs it with a lot of heart and soul. I think it's a really... yeah, it's a bit of more of a soppy ballad than what we've become used to with Bond films as of late, but I think largely it's a great song. The same cannot be said for the title sequence as a whole.
I'm very happy that Kleinman came back again, loved a lot of his work on previous Bond films, so this one is a little, odd. I don't know, there are a load of recreated scenes from the movie and then images of past Bond characters, which I was curious about when I first watched the film. At this point I had no idea where the plot was going to go, but seeing Silva, Vesper, Le Chiffre and M all represented here makes it kind of clear that we're supposed to be remembering past Craig adventures and that presumably some of those events are going to come into play here.
I start to get really nervous around this point because I really hope that they're not going to try and do something silly and ridiculous like tie all of the events of the previous films together in one neat little package here, but we'll get to that later.
Anyway, we rejoin the narrative in London, where Bond is getting a bollocking from M. Quick aside, but I really wish M had kept the painting he had behind his desk from the previous film of the old MI6 building, but it's not a biggie. Rafe finds as M is re-established here as a relatively soft, but nonetheless sharp speaker who can give Bond a bollocking just as good as his predecessor. We're introduced to a new character too, MI5 head Max Denby, played by Andrew Scott, who Bond prefers referring to by his codename of C.
I've heard a lot of people complain about the casting of Andrew Scott in this role because they say that it's clear immediately from the very first scene that he's in that he's a villain. I mean, he's creepy, he's Moriarty and Sherlock, for goodness sake. I don't really buy that criticism because I don't think that it's ever supposed to be a twist that he's a bad guy. I think we're supposed to know right off the bat that he's a bad guy, just like we know right off the bat that Goldfinger is a bad guy or Dr. No. It's like the Bond films don't ever really like have a surprise twist and the villain is someone you never suspected. And to be honest, in the films where they do that, like For Your Eyes Only and The Living Daylights, they tend to have some of the weaker villains of the series anyway.
Bond is paid a visit by Moneypenny, again played by the excellent Naomi Harris, later that day with a box containing personal effects from Skyfall after the place was blown up. I love it when we see Bond's bachelor pad and just how sparse it is. A few boxes, sofa, TV, plenty of stuff but not up on the walls. I guess this is all the stuff that MI6 placed into storage after Bond was presumed dead and they sold his flat off at the start of Skyfall. It's a very well designed flat and, dare I say, much better than the last time we saw Bond's private residence in Live and Let Die, where he looked to be living in a bungalow with crappy home gadgets he got from a department store. Anyway, turns out Bond shouldn't have been in Mexico at all, and Moneypenny presses him to reveal why he was there. Fortunately, Bond has an MP4 of Judi Dench's M telling him to go there, kill Sciarra, and then go to the man's funeral. Judging from his attire, this message was recorded shortly after she received one of those menacing videos from Silver in Skyfall. It's good to see that her presence is still felt in the series, but again, my concerns about just how much this film was going to attempt to tie the others together were growing somewhat. Bond gets Moneypenny to investigate the Pale King for him, and does some reminiscing over half-burnt papers and photos taken from Skyfall, including some foster parent papers and a photo of a young Bond with a bloke on top of a mountain. Ooh, very suspicious. Up next is some exposition, with the returning Rory Kinnear as Tanner, who explains that the new building, put up opposite the old derelict MI6, is C's new headquarters for national security, where he hopes to launch a program called 9 Eyes, after he is given access to the security information of 9 key world nations. Nothing sinister sounding about that. On to the Q scene.
Ah, 007.
Yes, finally, for the first time in the Craig era, we get a proper bona fide Q scene, with assistants tinkering about in the background and some good laughs. Ben Whishaw continues to be a wonderful addition to the series, and long may he reign. Bond is injected with a tracking device, which is an odd beat, as it's pretty similar to the thing that he had put in him in Casino Royale, but whatever. And there's a really strange moment here between Bond and Q. I wonder if anyone watching this video can help me out, explain what's going on here.
You see those readouts? We can monitor your vital signs from anywhere on the planet.
That sounds marvellous.
Call it a post-Mexico insurance policy. By direct order of M.
I completely understand.
Good. Right, well, I've just, got one last thing for you and you can be on your way.
I'm not entirely sure what we're supposed to think that Q is doing here. Is he taken aback by Bond being so compliant with such an authoritative order? I'm not sure what we're supposed to think.
Anyway, Bond doesn't get the swanky new Aston Martin, that's the 009, but he does get an exploding watch! Woohoo! A proper gadget. Guess Q quickly backtracked from his statements in Skyfall.
Were you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore.
We get a glimpse of Bond's rebuilt DB5, always nice to see the beauty, before Bond persuades Q to help him in his personal mission by not ratting him out to M. The next day, of course, Bond steals 009's Aston Martin and heads over to Rome to attend Sciarra's funeral, where he meets the late villain's widow, Lucia, played by the stunning Monica Bellucci, who it becomes clear is not far off following her husband into the ground. Now, after a bit of dialogue, Lucia returns home and puts on some music and starts walking through her home. We see some hitmen out of focus behind her. They're following her through the place. She seems to be aware that they're following her, and God, I just love this scene. This character knows that she is about to die, and all she wants is a last drink, some nice music, and a place to die peacefully. When Bond steps in and saves her, pumps her for information, namely her husband's employer, gives her Felix Leiter's number, and buggers off.
I have to go. Buona fortuna, Donna Lucia.
And that's it for Monica Bellucci in the film, which kinda sucks. This character was promoted heavily before the film was released, and it's Monica Bellucci, for goodness sake. I expected more from the character, and while I'm happy she was spared the role of sacrificial lamb, unlike, Solange, Strawberry, and Severine before her, I would have liked her character to have a larger role in the piece, maybe even mean more to the plot than just delivering the next clue to Bond. But that next clue leads Bond to a sinister boardroom meeting of nefarious-sounding characters talking about profits they're making from their various ventures, when in walks a shadowy figure. Much of the rest of the scene plays out in relative silence, as the power of this shadowy figure is exemplified by his, well, not having to move much more than an inch to get someone's attention, and saying very little but getting nothing but fearful, subservient reactions from the characters around him. Bond overhears things about attacks in other countries and the location of the Pale King, when Dave Bautista's Mr. Hinks appears to, in a classic Spectre fashion, dispatch of a failed henchperson with his stone-implanted thumbs. A nice little henchperson gimmick that isn't really played with enough to my mind. Anyway, after this display, the shadowy figure, of course played by Christoph Waltz, reveals himself to Bond, which does beg the question, if he knew Bond was there, why would he let him be privy to such incriminating information from the board? They talk about terrorist attacks they facilitated, which match up with the ones Tanner was talking about earlier. They discuss surveillance, which C was talking about earlier. You don't have to be an MI6 agent to put 2 and 2 together, but whatever, we haven't had an action sequence in a while, so let's get on with the car chase, shall we? Yes, Bond makes a getaway in a gadget-laden Aston Martin pursued by Mr. Hinks. We're in for a dynamic, action-packed car chase, right? Well, not really. The pace of this sequence never really gets going. Most of the scene is Bond talking to Moneypenny over the phone, so we're taking in a lot of exposition. Rome isn't exactly a great place for a big car chase. I mean, there's some beautiful scenery, don't get me wrong, but the roads are so narrow and the corners so sharp, it's hard for the cars to get a good bit of speed up. There isn't much in the way of spectacle, and a lot of the Aston's gadgets don't work. Admittedly, this does prompt a couple of funny moments, including one about 009's taste in music.
As a bit of an aside, I love that when we actually get to the end credits sequence, we find out that this is not the song sung by Frank Sinatra, but instead a cover version by a singer called Ray Quinn, who, for those of you who don't know, came second on the British version of the X Factor in 2006. Which means that 009 listens to CDs of rejected X Factor contestants whilst on missions. I think that's one of the most fascinatingly bizarre developments we've ever come across for a 00 agent. I mean, what does 005 do? Take a break from a mission to go and see the Eurovision every year? I mean,
I think the thing that kills the sequence the most, though, is how Craig plays it. I never feel tense or excited because he's, well, largely playing it as if he's just, well, relatively annoyed. Granted, some of these reactions are for laughs, but even Connery and Moore knew how to get the laugh when needed, but remain intense and focused when necessary to sell the audience on the danger. I'm just not sold that Bond is in a life and death situation here. It just feels like he's going through the motions, and while it's good for Bond to remain cool and in control in times of peril, it's just too much here. As lovely looking and sounding as this sequence is, and it does include my favourite bit of music in the entire soundtrack, it just doesn't do it for me overall. Anyway, exposition-wise, we find out that the Pale King is actually Mr. White from the first two Craig movies. Christoph Waltz is playing a man called Oberhauser, but it's obviously Blofeld, so I don't know why they bother with the pretense. Oh, and Moneypenny has a boyfriend, which is a nice little detail. But for all my gripes about the car chase, I do love how it ends, with Bond himself finally using an ejector seat the way it's supposed to be used.
Good evening.
The only thing that would have made that more perfect would be if the man was drinking and looked at the bottle. And a double-taking pigeon. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, M and Tanner attend a meeting where C is trying to get approval of his 9i security program, but there's a holdout from South Africa, which obviously won't bode too well for them. Q covers Bond's ass from M, and we see that he's heading to Altersee in Austria, where the next chunk of the film takes place.
the next few scenes of the film are something that I never thought I would actually see in the Bond series. I mean, I'm going to complain a lot later on about how this film tries really hard to create this close-knit continuity in the Daniel Craig films, but bringing back Jesper Christensen as Mr. White from Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace is something that I will be forever grateful to this film for.
It's well known that Mr. White was supposed to be killed at the end of Quantum of Solace, but those scenes were cut and have never been released, so instead here we have the villain back, making him the only villainous character to return and be played by the same actor in 3 separate films in the series. After Skyfall, I never thought we'd see this guy again, in all honesty. I was sure Quantum would never be revisited, so having him here and woven into the plot is great for major Bond fans like myself and probably you watching this. White is dying of radiation poisoning as a result of disobeying Spectre High Command due to his, well, moral objections to the organisation exploiting women and children for their schemes. The dialogue between him and Bond is great. Little acting touches from Christensen, like having to use 2 hands to prime Bond's gun, are so lovely, and it's just great having the guy back, even for such a short scene. He tells Bond to protect his daughter, who he says is very good at hiding, then gives Bond her location, which it apparently isn't that far away at all, so I'm not sure she's that good at hiding, but whatever. The daughter will lead Bond to Le Marocain, and from there Bond will be able to find Spectre's headquarters. White then shoots himself with Bond's gun, and thus ties up a continuity thread that was lingering for a good 7 years. Well done, Eon. If I come away from this movie appreciating anything, it's this.
You're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond. So long.
Anyway, Bond heads to the private clinic where White's daughter works. Very nice visual callbacks to Piers Gloria from Majesty's Secret Service, and it's here over an hour into the film that we're introduced to our main Bond girl, Madeleine Swann, played by Léa Seydoux.
My name is Dr. Madeleine Swann. Our job today is to analyze your needs, both psychological and physical.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Bond is very frank with Swann, and there's little in the way of charm from Craig. He's very down to business, which is nice, but then he does have the hard task of telling Swann that he's there at the behest of her now-late father. Swann, of course, doesn't react well to this news, but Bond hangs about anyway, providing us with one of the very best comedic moments in the entire film.
Can I get you something, sir?
Vodka martini, shaken, not stirred.
I'm sorry, we don't serve alcohol.
I'm really starting to love this place.
You'll have the prolytic digestive enzyme shake.
Then we get something very surprising. Q turns up in the field. Again, I'm going to complain a bit more later on about how overused some of the MI6 regulars are in this film, but I love that Q gets to come along for this next chunk of the film, at least. The chemistry between him and Bond is great, and I love his jumper. I would really like one for myself.
Here you are, sir. One prolytic digestive enzyme shake.
Do me a favor, will you? Throw that down the toilet. Cut out the middleman.
Bond sees Swann being marched away by Hinks, and we have one of my very favourite Craig Bond moments.
No escape.
I love that so much. He talks to the guy like a pet. It's just awesome. And then we get into the next action sequence of the film, featuring Bond giving chase in a plane. Nice Roger Moore callback aside, this sequence, again, leaves me quite cold. There are some nice, tense cutaways with Q being stalked by a pair of nefarious chaps, but the main stuff with Bond and Hinks never really gets my pulse going. I think perhaps it's the logistics. Plane versus car just doesn't lend itself to dynamic moves and action. Not like a helicopter that can pivot and turn on a dime, hover, etc. All Bond can really do in a plane is, well, charge it in one direction, but whatever. He saves Swann and makes the stupid decision not to check that Hinks is well and truly dead before reconvening with Q, who has some exposition for us. That pretty much every villain we've seen Craig's Bond do battle with, including Le Chiffre, Green, Patrice, Sciarra, Mr. White, and even Silver, were all part of the same organisation run by Blofeld. Oh, no, wait, sorry, Franz Oberhauser.
So Quantum is a tangent of Spectre then, eh? Well, I mean, that makes sense, logically, but Silver, really? I can't imagine how he would fit into this organisation, because he was such a rogue and a renegade and had such a personal mission to get this one woman that it doesn't make any sense to me.
Anyway, Madeleine takes Bond to L'American, which is a hotel in Tangier. Now, pacing-wise, this is where the film grinds to an absolute halt for me, as we have dialogue between Bond and Swann, and I get that this is intended as an intimate, quiet scene with Bond searching the room and Madeleine getting very drunk, but I think it takes for granted how much as an audience we like Madeleine at this point. My main issue with her is that she's so, well, dull.
She was clearly written with the intent of being Bond's next great love, like Vesper or Tracy, but Vesper was cool and witty and sharp-tongued, and Tracy was damaged and complex, but still had great warmth and, could hold her own in an action sequence like the car chase. Swann just comes across as a bit wet, so I never sort of elevate her to a standing other than just a regular old Bond girl, which is clearly not how she's being written, and I don't think this is the fault of the actress. I just think it's a poorly written character.
I would honestly rather see Bond go through the rest of his mission with this mouse as his sidekick than Swann. The mouse is warmer, funnier, and more useful to the plot as it leads Bond to a secret room where Mr. White hid all of his nefarious villain stuff, including a VHS tape of Vesper Lynd's interrogation. I was really hoping we'd get a reprise of Eva Green at this point, but alas, it's not to be. Instead, Bond finds some coordinates to head to, which require him to hop on a train with Swann. Meanwhile, through all this stuff with Bond globe-hopping, we've been cutting back to London, where C gets his 9-eye surveillance program off the ground and decides to disband the 00 program. I do like this scene in particular, where it's clear that M is just holding back the urge to punch the cocky git in the mouth. Then we head back to Bond and Madeline and have some very From Russia with Love reminiscent scenes involving Bond and Swan chatting in a carriage and then having dinner, white tuxedo, before a fight breaks out with Hinks. It's a good fight, but the way Hinks is dispatched of leaves a lot to be desired.
Shoot.
It's such an inconclusive end, and I'm not sure if this is a Jaws-esque thing where they might bring him back in the future, or if at some point in production he came back to play a part later in the finale. If the Sony email hack told us one thing about this film, it's that sections were being hastily rewritten as the film neared and started filming, and the biggest changes came at the end of the film. It wouldn't surprise me if at one point Hinks was set to return, but whatever. I have a bigger complaint around this point.
What do we do now?
I saw this film in cinemas 4 times, and each time this moment prompted nothing but laughter from the audience. I'm not sure if we're supposed to think that this is funny or what. Bond and Madeline have been through a life and death fight and then decide to screw. It's a funny concept, it's a good gag, but at this point in the movie we're supposed to be getting the sense that these two are falling in love. And I never get that sense despite the reprise of the theme music and the romantic glances. By this point with Vesper we'd had the shower scene. With Tracy we'd had the all the time in the world montage. With Swan we've not had anything even vaguely resembling those. I wouldn't mind if we weren't supposed to believe that Bond was falling in love with this girl, but later on it becomes especially clear that we in fact are supposed to believe that yes, he is falling in love with her like he did Vesper, like he did Tracy. Anyway, Bond and Swan hop off in the middle of nowhere and are greeted by a lovely chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. It's clear through C's surveillance program that Spectre have been tracking Bond's every move, but I'd love to know what Bond would have done had he not been rumbled and they knew to send the car. I mean, him and Swan turn up and don't really look like they know where they are and just kind of wait around. How long would they have done that for exactly before deciding to make a move? Our heroes arrive at the villain's lair, a plush-looking complex in the middle of a giant crater. First impressions of this are like, wow, great. Okay, this is like a classic Bond villain location. I'm really into this crater thing. There's a nice bit of Doctor No referencing here too, as the pair are shown 2 hotel-like rooms, but in this case their rooms are kitted out with family photos. Madeline with her father and Bond with a grown man and a young Christoph Waltz.
It's at this point during my first viewing of the film that I start to get incredibly worried. I mean, surely they're not going to do something as stupid and inane as make Bond and Blofeld brothers. I mean, plenty of people worked on this film. Someone, somewhere, must have stood up and been like, you know what, guys, this is a really stupid thing to do. Shall we not bother with it?
Bond and Madeline are shown into well, I don't know, really, a dark room with a meteorite in it or something?
Touch it. You can touch it if you want.
Okay, that's another moment that always got an unintentional laugh from every audience that I saw this film at the cinema with.
But yes, we finally get a good view of the film's main villain. Oberhauser for the time being. The most interesting moment here, I think, is when Oberhauser says he paid Madeline a visit when she was a girl.
I came to your home once to see your father.
I don't remember that.
But I do.
This, I think, is a reference to a scene earlier on the train where Madeline talked about how a man came to her house to kill her father when she was a young girl, but she knew where her father kept his gun, and it strongly implied that she killed the intruder. Now, obviously, if Oberhauser was the intruder, he wasn't killed, but it's a nice, subtle connection between the pair, and perhaps in another version of the script it was elaborated on further, but here it's just kinda left lingering. Bond and Swan then get a tour around the facility, where Oberhauser explains that Spectre have been in cahoots with C all along, surprise, surprise, and have been assisting in developing the Nine Eyes program by staging terrorist attacks around the world in exchange for access to the unlimited surveillance that the Nine Eyes program would provide. So that's our big villain plot for this film.
Bit of a weak one, no? I guess it feels weak because it feels so real. It's like, I mean, this is supposed to be Spectre, the organisation with some of the most fun and outlandish world domination plots in cinema history, and here they're just resorting to surveillance? I mean, yeah, it's creepy, obviously, to have, you know, this big brother organisation watching everything you do and whatever, but, I mean, I think everyone already kind of feels that governments do that anyway. It's like CCTV and surveillance is everywhere as it is anyway, so... I mean, this doesn't feel like too much of an escalation, but I guess the reason for that is that we don't really actually see a reason, like, what Spectre would actually do with this power if they had it. Like, they keep talking about these attacks, and, like, the one in South Africa. Maybe Bond should have been at that attack in South Africa, and we'd have actually had, like, a on-the-ground view of it. And then we would have understood that what Spectre could achieve with these powers, because at the moment, it's just people talking about it, and we don't actually see anything.
As if to exemplify the extent of his surveillance powers, Oberhauser plays the footage of Bond and White's interaction from earlier. It's at this point that Bond acts very strangely.
You have my word. No, turn this off.
Your word? The word of an assassin?
Turn this off.
This is important.
I said turn it off!
Okay, why is he behaving so erratic? I mean, he's really concerned about Madeleine seeing this tape, and when I first saw the film, I thought I'd missed something, like, had the footage been doctored to make it look as if Bond killed White, or what? I get that it must be a horrible thing for a child to see their parents shoot themselves like this, but Bond's reaction is way over the top, screaming like that and charging at Blofeld? What the hell? All just so Madeleine doesn't watch the moment? Couldn't he have just said it quietly to her? Like, don't look, love? Bond is usually very frank about death and killing. It's part of his job, and Madeleine knows her dad is dead anyway, so this reaction from Bond feels so out of place.
So long.
Anyway, Bond is taken away to a white room and strapped to a chair for the film's torture scene. There's a white cat in the room, so obviously any moment now we're going to learn that Oberhauser is Blofeld, even though every fibre of my being is hoping that this won't be the case. Bond and Oberhauser growing up together, fine, I could go with that, but Blofeld? Blofeld? Madeleine is the one responsible for opening this can of worms when she asks Oberhauser why he's doing all this, and then we get a speech which... I hate so much. Basically, Oberhauser's father took in the orphaned Bond and looked after him and taught him to ski. Oberhauser was upset and killed his dad and has been responsible for every bad thing that has happened in Bond's life since Vesper's death. Targeting Bond with the villains he's faced in order to seek revenge for stealing his daddy's affections. Oh, and, by the way, that thing we all knew from the moment Waltz's casting was announced is revealed here.
Franz Oberhauser died 20 years ago, James, in an avalanche alongside his father. The man you're talking to now, the man inside your head, is Ernst Stafford Blofeld.
Okay, this whole development is pretty unforgivable as far as I'm concerned. The stupidity behind making Bond and Blofeld brothers is just astonishing. But fine, if you're going to make that plot development, commit to it. Make us feel it. I never get any sense of familiarity between these two. I mean, God, they're supposed to have, like, grown up as kids together. Like, there's no familiarity in their performances. They just interact like Bond would with any other villain. And it's like, I mean, does it make you appreciate Casino Royale anymore, or Quantum of Solace, or Silver's Revenge against M, to know that this guy was behind it, being like, all right, yeah, I see you've got this plan with this money and whatnot. But by the way, if this one guy investigates, could you bash his balls in a bit and give him an especially hard time, just for me? I mean, like, I just can't believe that this is in the film. Like, someone at some point must have understood that this was an inane idea. Does anyone out there actually like this development? Because I can't fathom how any fan would have anything other than just abject hatred for this development. It's awful. Absolutely appalling.
Something else I hate about this scene, Bond is being tortured by a little drill going into his skull, and Blofeld goes on about how if he uses it in a certain place, Bond will no longer be able to recognise faces of people he knows. Now, this is an interesting concept, don't get me wrong, and to be honest, I can't wait to see how it plays out. Oh wait, it doesn't. It bears no relevance to anything. After the torture is over, he just recognises Swan and everyone else later on just fine. Disappointment is piled on disappointment as Bond escapes the situation with the help of his explosive watch. Blofeld is down and Bond gets into a gunfight with a dozen or so goons, and given that this is a huge facility with lots of staff, we saw them all earlier on, you know, you'd think that you were in for a great big old Bond in a villain-based climax, right? Well, no, because this isn't actually the climax. The fight is over super quickly, and the place blows up even quicker. Seriously, along with Green and Quantum, why do villains in this organization insist on building lairs that go up in smoke quicker than a bit of petrol-doused tracing paper? Obviously Blofeld isn't dead, but we must act under this apprehension along with Bond for a bit as he returns to London to meet with M, Q, Moneypenny and Tanner in order to arrest C and shut down the Nine Eyes surveillance program before it goes online. Here is where I feel the MI6 regulars are being overused in a real be careful what you wish for situation for me. I always go on about how much I love the regulars and how great it is whenever we're treated to seeing them out in the field, in the action with Bond, and yet here it's just too much. It feels like the Super Friends gang have arrived, ready to help. I probably wouldn't have minded so much if there'd been a couple more MI6 staffers with them, so it wasn't so blatantly, oh look, his mates are here to help. Especially when Moneypenny and Tanner don't really have a whole lot to do. It's M and Q that do most of the work here in the climax. Swan, rather suddenly, decides that enough is enough and wants out. Maybe she should have considered this earlier, perhaps on the incredibly long flight back from Tangier, but whatever. The reason she gives is that she doesn't want to be with James because his lifestyle reminds her too much of her father's old line of work, and she's jolly well had enough of it. Let's be hoping for her sake, then, that she doesn't get kidnapped or anything while walking around the dark streets of London.
Her goodbye with Bond is so just meaningless, and his response to her leaving is just kind of like, oh, okay, just gonna go get back in the car. It's like, I mean, if his reaction is like that, then as an audience member, what am I supposed to think? Because I've not been able to invest anything in this woman because I've been given nothing to invest in.
En route to C's Tower, the MI6 gang are attacked and Bond is taken by some thugs who he promptly kills before realising he's in front of the old, burnt-out MI6 building. It's pretty cool that we get to see what becomes of the classic location after the events of Skyfall, but the little trip down memory lane that Blofeld provides Bond with is very silly. The name on the memorial wall, no mention of Tiago Rodriguez, by the way, and then a bunch of pictures of past Bond villains and allies alike. It all gets a little bit too comic book villainy for me here. It's very silly to imagine Blofeld wandering around the MI6 building putting these things up. Not to mention, it's hard to imagine how Blofeld got some of these images, given some of them look to be taken from very specific moments from previous films.
And it's up to you.
And then, the way Bond behaves here when he stops and pauses at the sight of Mr. White and then turns to see M. What am I to think is going through his mind here? Like, oh, this is serious business now. He's shown me pictures of people I used to know. What? I never got the sense that Bond would have cared, quite frankly, and it's not as if it puts him in a rage. And I mean, Vesper, Le Chiffre, M, Silver, they've all been mentioned and referenced several times in the film so far, so now it just feels like overkill. Gotta love how there's no sight of Green at all, though. It's like Blofeld knew not to bother with that one. Bond eventually comes face to face with Blofeld, complete with trademark scar behind some bulletproof glass. Bond quickly adapts to calling the character Blofeld, by the way, considering, you know, growing up as a child with the same guy as a brother named Franz, but whatever. The pair exchange words, and it's here that Walt seals his fate as quite possibly the worst Blofeld of the official Eon series so far. This is the moment where he should step his performance up a notch. He's been so cool, calm and collected this whole time, positively pleasant in fact, and now is when we should get some true crazy, some true villainy. He's scarred, blind in one eye, almost had all of his hard worked out plans fail, and now he's just out for revenge against this one guy, but no, still plays it exactly the same. Meanwhile, literally across the river, M and Q are foiling C's plan to launch the surveillance program before the arbitrary countdown hits 0. And when I say arbitrary, I mean arbitrary. Like, there's no reason why the surveillance program couldn't be turned off 5-10 minutes after it launches. I mean, surveillance is only really worth anything over a period of time, surely. If they shut it down a short while after the countdown, then, well, I mean, who cares? What is Spectre gonna do with 5 minutes worth of surveillance? And besides, Bond blew up Spectre's lair with all their staff in it, so who's even gonna be reviewing the surveillance footage? Did a whole lot of Spectre interns just get promotions? Anyway, at least we get one of the funniest moments of the film here between M and C.
How predictably moronic. But then isn't that what M stands for? Moron.
And now we know what C stands for.
He means cunt.
Careless.
Okay.
Of course, Q succeeds, and after a clumsy little fight, C accidentally falls to his death, which is a bit underwhelming, but okay, whatever. There's still a big villain fight to go, right? Speaking of which, Blofeld has rigged the MI6 building to blow, with Madeleine in it, and gives Bond 3 minutes to either escape or find her. It's a big building, and there's no real logic to where Bond runs, but fortunately he finds Madeleine in the last place he ends up, when he hears her banging and screaming from inside a cupboard. Not sure how she managed that, considering she's completely tied up and gagged, but whatever. I do love, though, how Blofeld just sticks around in a helicopter watching. He's just like, yep, I'm not missing this for anything. We get some nice scoring moments from Thomas Newman as Bond and Swan escape in a boat as the MI6 building explodes, which feels kinda odd to me. Maybe it's because I live in London and see this building quite regularly, but I mean, presumably they're gonna be erasing it from all shots of London now, as long as this continuity is kept up, and I mean, I think there's an odd attempt at symbolism, with Blofeld truly destroying Bond's former workplace, a symbol of British intelligence, but it's less impactful when, just last film, we saw it blow up when it was still in service and being used, so I'm not sure what the significance is here on a thematic level. Anyway, sadly there's no Q-boat, but Bond and Swan do race along the Thames to stop Blofeld, and instead of an action-packed finale, we just get Bond shooting at a helicopter a couple of times and eventually being able to bring it down on Westminster Bridge. This whole section in London has been rather underwhelming so far. There has been no great action or set piece, it all feels so small scale, but perhaps a final confrontation between Blofeld and Bond, brothers that they are, will be in some way appeasing?
Finish it.
Well, no, it's terrible. The worst moment in the film, and quite possibly in all of Bond canon. Blofeld is injured and crawling away when Bond points his gun at him. Blofeld tells him to finish it, and quite frankly, yes, why not? But the very fact that Blofeld is behaving this way is ridiculous. Blofeld would never give his own life to prove a point to his enemy, and what point is that exactly? Bond is a killer, he has a license to kill, he kills baddies, and it's not as if it has been a theme of the film that he shouldn't be killing people. So if Blofeld isn't trying to prove some kind of point, then is he actually suicidal? Does he think having Bond kill him will haunt Bond for the rest of his life? Because quite frankly, I think Bond would be better off just killing the guy. The best I can muster is that he must think that Swan won't have the hots for Bond if she sees him kill the guy, but why that is, I really don't know. Bottom line, this ending sucks. Fair enough, leave Blofeld open to come back in a future installment, but at least end his presence in this film in a satisfying way. Bond strolls off and, in the epilogue, drops by Q Branch to pick up his rebuilt DB5 and drives off with Swan to the same damn version of the Bond theme we've heard for the previous 4 films in a row now.
Seriously, can we please just get a new version of it? I mean, how hard could it be? I appreciate that David Arnold is presumably still getting royalties for this particular arrangement, but I mean, God, they've been ending every Craig Bond film for the past 9 years with this same bit of music. I mean, I would appreciate some variety.
As for what the ending itself actually means, Bond driving off with Swan in this way gives the impression that Bond has packed in the spy work for good and is ready to settle down with her, but I mean, that's my interpretation of what I think the film is trying to say, but there's something that feels more final about this particular ending than others in the series. It feels like they're telling us that Swan isn't just a one-time screw and that she means more to Bond, but what the film thinks it's achieving and what it is actually achieving are two very different things.
And that sentiment probably gives you a good impression about my general opinions of this film.
When this one first hit cinemas, I don't think I've known the fandom more like evenly split than on Spectre. It feels like a real 50-50 love-hate thing. I'll admit, one of the reasons it took me so long to get to this review is because this one needed more time to sink in than any other Bond film I've seen at the cinema, and it has sunk in, and it's definitely on the lower end of the ranking, if not the very bottom. I don't think a Bond film has ever had such great ambitions as Spectre. It's trying to tie all these previous Craig films together and make it seem like everything is connected. It's a very modern thing to do in the age of the cinematic universe, but it just doesn't work for Bond. We don't need to go back to Vesper, we don't need to go back to Silver. Those stories are done and don't need dragging up. Mr. White was a loose end, and I'm very grateful we got some closure on that, but everything else? Bleh. It's not even like I can get excited by particular action sequences. In Spectre, they're also tepid and half-baked. My adrenaline never gets going. For all of Quantum of Solace's failings, there are at least a few standout action sequences that are fun to go back to. The musical scoring being so similar to Skyfall also doesn't help. It just makes the whole thing feel lazy, and I know this isn't the case because so much love, effort, and attention go into making these films, but still. In terms of positives, Craig is still absolutely great in the role. It's nice to see Q in the field, initially, and Hinks is great in his first few scenes. Some of the sets are really cool, but there's so much stuff to absolutely hate here. Blofeld is completely wasted, and it's the fault of both the script and the performance. The brothers thing is beyond stupid, and Waltz just doesn't do anything interesting with the part. Swan would have been a fine Bond girl to have along for an adventure if the script wasn't trying to constantly make out that she means more to Bond than just being a week-long fling. The MI6 gang coming together at the end of the story was a real case of be careful what you wish for me. I've constantly gone on and on in these videos about how much I want to see more of M, Q, and Moneypenny, and how I love it when Q gets out of London in License to Kill, and when Moneypenny gets to go to the races in View to a Kill, but in Spectre, it's too much. Years ago, when I made a Bond film ranking video, I gave Dr. No as my baseline example for judging whether a Bond film is good. I like Dr. No a lot, it's very good, but it's also very vanilla. It's a template Bond adventure that other films can come along and improve upon. Basically, when it comes to my ranking, anything Dr. No or above is good, and anything below is bad. Spectre is way below that baseline. I'll have to get to a proper re-ranking sometime to see where it comes, but suffice it to say it's not in good company. If you can enjoy this film at all, then great. But for me, I've never been more disappointed leaving the cinema after a Bond film than this, and that includes after my initial viewings of Die Another Day and Quantum of Solace.
So what? Even a bad Bond film is better than no Bond film at all, and with Bond 25 slowly getting into gear, please do stay tuned to this channel for regular updates, opinions, speculation, and great conversations in the comment section as always. On that note, so long for now, Bond fans.